Hello and welcome. As the world's leading arms supplier, how dependent is the US on conflicts to keep the cash coming in? Could America be fueling global instability through its military interests? Washington has stationed thousands of soldiers all over the world for what it calls the purpose of peace, stability and democracy, but at the same time it has expanded its role as the leading supplier of weapons to the world. At the height of the global recession in 2008, when arms sales fell, the US actually increased its share of all foreign ordnance deals to more than two-thirds of the global supply, according to a report by the nonpartisan US group Congressional Research Service. The document also says the US signed agreements for 70% of all weapons sold to developing nations, and that many of its customers are countries who are accused of using those weapons for human rights violations. Today we ask, to what extent is the US weapons industry profiting from and contributing to conflict around the world? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me now from New York is William Hartung, Director of the US-based Arms and Security Initiative at the New American Foundation. His organization tracks weapons proliferation as well as the economics and politics of military spending. And here in Washington, D.C., I have Joel Johnson of the Teal Group Corporation, an American aerospace and defense consulting company. It forecasts the production of and the markets for a variety of aerospace and defense equipment. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show.
Pleased to be here.
William Hartung, sir, if I could start with you in New York. America has control of more than two-thirds of the global weapons market. Isn't that essentially fueling war and laying foundations for instability, as opposed to creating a safer and more a democratic world, or at least potentially peaceful world, which every US president seems to proclaim is the main goal of the US?
Well, I think in many cases it's destabilizing. We did a report and we found that of 27 active conflicts as of a few years ago, 20 of them involve weapons supplied by the United States. Now, you can argue about who was right, who was wrong in those wars, but the fact is when you're supplying that many, you're clearly stoking the fire. Likewise, there's a danger of regional arms races, arming both sides of a potential conflict, arms to human rights abusers. There's many different ways that these sales, which are promoted as a way to foster stability, have all kinds of negative consequences.
In your opinion, Mr. Hartung, what's behind the growth for the US in particular? Why is it America has taken such a big chunk of the market?
Well, I think part of it is economic. Part of it is people want to buy a political relationship with America. Part of it is the systems are better. You know, I think you have to grant that to the US industry. They provide very sophisticated equipment.
Well, Joel Johnson, good to have you as well, sir. Is America actually meeting an existing demand? Is it supplying to that demand, or is it actually creating a demand?
Yeah, I would argue very much we are supplying an existing demand. If you look at where weapon systems are going right now, for example, there are major competitions in India, which is primarily a response to China expanding very rapidly its defense, a blue water navy, a large air force, partly Russian supplied, partly indigenous. If we look elsewhere in the world, Brazil's probably the other major contest going on right now. Probably has a lot to do with Chavez next door receiving $1.5 billion of Russian weaponry. Latin America generally has been very low-key on arms purchases. Less than 1% of their GNP goes into weapon systems. So, you know, no, I would argue by and large, if you look around where the world's conflict is, we'll put it the other way around. I think the U.S. has been very careful as to who it sells weapons to, and often we have been indeed a stabilizing influence. For example, we supply Greece and Turkey. There has not been a conflict with U.S. weapons in Greece and Turkey since we started becoming suppliers as opposed to some other countries.
I'll get on to some of those issues in a second, but let me ask you, Mr. Johnson, just to answer you know, the kinds of emails we've had from some of our viewers. And we had a couple, I'll give them back to back. One from Abdul Ismail says, world instability works to the benefit of arms suppliers. The US military industry requires raising tensions, potential confrontation, and conflict in order to generate new sales and ensure profits for shareholders. And a similar one from Mike Koppel says, stability and peace are not profitable for the previous and current US governments. Now, when you hear those kind of views, how do you regard those views that effectively America is almost like dependent on creating conflict or seeking conflict to keep its defense?
Again, I mean, on the contrary, look who do we by and large sell weapons to? Our number one customers are the industrial democracies, Europe, Japan, Korea. Okay? None of them are fighting anybody at the moment and haven't for half a century. If you look at our third world major clients, obviously the Gulf states are very important customers. Their concern is Iran, which obviously we haven't supplied weapons to since the Shah. And by the way, those F-14s, of course, have been inoperable ever since the revolution there. But clearly, the Gulf states perceive a threat and have, I would agree with Bill. I mean, two reasons they buy American weapons. I mean, when you step back, first off, the bulk of our market is the United States of America, obviously. And most of the stuff that comes out of our industry, the big dollar tickets aren't used against much of anybody. I mean, they were there from the Cold War. They are there as a deterrent. But if you look at our surface Navy, if you look at certainly our nuclear systems, neither are sold, nor do they have, or do they need conflict to sell. In fact, we would argue, I think, that our weapons are best used when they are not used. That is, they prevent conflict.
Well, let's get a caller on the line. Ismail is on the line from Germany. Ismail, what would you like to add to the debate?
Yeah, I just want to ask, the American is trying to invade Iraq, and perhaps the next one will be Iran. About this arms deals, and America is selling arms to the whole African country, the African Achilles issue, like my country in Liberia. Charles Taylor was funded and supported by the American government, and the American trying to put sanctions on other countries. And I don't want to.
Actually, interesting point, Ismail. Let's get this to William Hartung. Why isn't there a global regulation on arms trade, something that actually has some kind of control or some kind of restriction on where those arms go?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, I think the industry doesn't want it. I think groups like the NRA don't want it. I think governments often want flexibility who they're going to sell to, so that they don't want to have sort of strict standards that are applied equally to all. So I realize it's incumbent somewhat on civil society to say, we don't like the consequences of this. We don't like the risk of conflict. We don't like these arms being used by human rights abusers. There is a move at the UN for a global arms trade treaty, which would set standards on sales to human rights abusers, limit those wherever possible. There's work in small arms to try to keep arms out of certain regions like West Africa. So there's been a lot of proposals, a lot of agitation, but nothing's been concluded as yet other than sort of sharing information and transparency measures.
Fawzan's on the line from Saudi Arabia. Fawzan, what would you like to ask?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Riz,
yeah.
I find myself privileged to talk to the biggest terrorists of the world, okay, who make trillions, if not billions, from the wars and from the type of the lobbies that they make, and they earn money for themselves and for their governments. Okay, so what do they think of any human rights? Do they think of anything about their human lives? Do they think of any misery that they cause in the world?
Fawzan, let me put this to Mr. Johnson here, because he's in the studio. In terms of ensuring that these arms don't go, 70%. I mean, if it's 70% is coming from the US, then they're going to filter into pretty much everywhere around the world. Is there anything that the US does to restrict, to ensure that countries that have human rights abuses and potentially can use those arms against American troops, for example, don't get their hands on them?
Yes, certainly. The underlying legislation that we've had since the 70s basically says arms transfers are only allowed by the U.S. government when it is in the foreign policy interests of the United States, not for economic reasons. We sell nothing as industry without a license from the U.S. government. The U.S. government is an elected body. I don't think anybody would want our companies to set their own foreign policy. So we do nothing except we don't even market a system without permission from the U.S. government. So we are completely a controlled industry. I think it's important to some degree to differentiate between small arms and the kind of things that often go on in a place like Africa, which are basically what killed most people, and there's very little dollar amounts involved. I mean, you could boycott, you could cut off all small arms from the U.S. It would make no difference whatsoever to the industry as a whole. It would make a difference to a couple of suppliers. But I think what you'll find in Africa is an awful lot of AK-47s floating around from about 15 different countries that make them. It's probably, I would make one point to add to what Bill said earlier. When I was in industry for years, we consistently said we would support an international treaty on arms transfers because our restrictions on us are already more than that of any of our competitors. Anything that could be agreed to in the UN would actually advantage the U.S. defense industry.
Let me ask you, just to break down the numbers here a little bit for you and show our viewers some of the numbers that are involved here. In 2008, at the height of the recession, the global recession, the total value of weapons deals signed around the world was $55.2 billion, of which the US signed deals worth $37.8 billion, so around 69%, as we said, of all weapons sold by one country, though. I mean, surely that can't be a formula for global stability.
Well, again, people choose where they want. Countries decide what they need in terms of their military requirements, and then they decide who to buy them from. Now, it's not terribly surprising that the United States, which our internal market is roughly 50%, 45–50% of the world's defense production, and in terms of our research and development, we do about 6 times what Europe does. We ought to have a comparative advantage. Our systems should be better. If they weren't, our industry would be in deep trouble. I mean, our industry should be ashamed if we didn't produce the best quality stuff. Countries that are going to spend their taxpayers' money, by and large, want the best quality stuff.
Now, those best quality might end up being used against U.S. troops, though, in some places.
I don't think you can find a single instance in 50 years, half a century since World War II, where a U.S. weapon system has ever been used against a U.S. troop, barring maybe something like M16s, because who knows where those things go. But in terms of anything larger than an RPG, a grenade, you will not find an instance where U.S. weapon systems have been used against U.S. troops. It doesn't happen. We're very careful.
Let's get some more figures out here. And William Hartung, if I can put these to you, some more numbers. 2 of America's biggest customers are actually bitter enemies. We have, and they're nuclear powers. For example, India was the 2nd highest buyer of U.S. weapons in the developing world after Saudi Arabia, at close to $31 billion. And Pakistan also paid close to $12 billion. So it's a lot of weaponry sold by America to those neighbors who fought 3 wars and came to a 4th one in 2008, close to a war after the attacks on Mumbai by Pakistani extremists. Now, what do you see as the inherent risks? I mean, what do you see as the risks of the U.S. conducting deals with countries that might have this kind of conflict base?
Well, I think it's a huge mistake. I mean, in the case of Pakistan, we've been selling them F-16s, which some of their own intelligence officials have said could be the most likely delivery vehicle if they ever used a nuclear weapon against India. To then arm India with fighter planes just ratchets up the spending. Pakistan, in part, has pursued nuclear weapons because they say India has a conventional advantage over them. So you build up Pakistan and conventional weapons, you build up Indian conventional weapons, and basically you're at the beginning of a spiraling arms race, which then, if the tensions boil to a certain point, it just means both sides have more destructive capacity than they would otherwise.
Well, so we're going to take a very short break here, gentlemen. I ask you to stand by with more questions on our discussion when we return in just a moment. Welcome back. We're examining the booming American arms industry, which is now responsible for more than 68% of all global arms sales. While US soldiers are stationed around the world to ostensibly minimize conflict, its weapons exports appear to contradict that mission. From New York, I'm joined by William Hartung of the US-based New America Foundation, which tracks issues such as weapons proliferation and military spending. And in the studio with me is Joel Johnson, who spent 16 years with the Aerospace Industries Association of America, which represents 100 major U.S. manufacturers of military and commercial hardware. As we get back to questions, Mr. Johnson, a quick question for you about who the rivals are. I mean, if America's taking a share in terms of the global arms industry, who's it taking the share from?
Well, predominantly probably from Russia. What happened, if you go back and look at earlier data, Russia had a much higher percentage because they were giving the stuff away and or selling to countries that were on our prohibited list. Other major rivals or competitors that are in the Western world would be France and the UK, be the 2 largest. Germany to some degree, oddly enough, some from Sweden. On smaller systems, Israel is a very active competitor. The Japanese, who have a good capability, don't export arms for historical reasons, so they're not in the mix. The Chinese have not done much except with small arms. So that, I mean, again, the Russians are a peculiar one because we almost never are in the same market at the same time.
Well, I'll get onto some of those clients in just a second, but let's get Braun in from South Africa with a question. Braun, go ahead.
Hi. Firstly, I'd like to ask Joel. You mentioned that the M15s, who knows where those land up, and you also mentioned that a place like Africa is a place which gets arms from other countries as well. I would like to ask you in front of all the viewers, what is this place called Africa, or do you mean a continent or a country? And are you aware of whether or not your arms sales are influenced by political will or power of the U.S. government? And lastly, I wanted to ask, how do you sleep at night?
I didn't catch the last, but
oh yeah, how do you sleep at night?
I sleep very well at night, partly because we do nothing that is not sanctioned by our government, which is elected by the people. Secondly, I think if you look at Africa, you'll find that it's an insignificant market from an economics perspective. I'm not talking about human rights or tragedy. I'm just saying, if you're interested in where's the U.S. defense industry interested, Africa wouldn't count. The only major sales that have gone to Africa recently, to South Africa, have been by Europeans, as you well know, BAE and Saab. There have been really no major weapons sales that I can think of on the part of the U.S. anywhere in Africa. I only mentioned that small arms like M16s because they have gotten around the world. It's very hard to keep track of things that are in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. We know where every jet airplane is that we've sold. We know where our tanks are. I'm just saying that it's even though there are strings attached, I can't guarantee that in all cases everybody knows exactly where every M16 is.
Well, let me get William Hartigan again, and a question to you, sir, from a viewer by the name of Stephen Chundama, who wrote in saying, the problem is the choice of countries the US sells arms to. Thus, the remaining countries are forced to accumulate arms from other sources, which causes the arms race. Now, to what degree is that a simplification of the reality? Wouldn't America essentially be the source of choice for most places anyway? And how do you see, when you talk about proliferation, how do you see other countries coming in on the scene? Mr. Johnson was describing certain competitors, but how do you see that growing?
Well, I think first of all, in terms of the split of the market, I think because the United States dominates so much of it, there's only a few places for other countries to go, and a lot of times those are countries that are such heinous human rights abusers that even our own government takes a pass, places like Burma, Zimbabwe, etc. But to get back to something that Mr. Johnson said, our weapons have been used against us in the past. In Panama, in Iraq, we gave them technology to build weapons. In Afghanistan, the whole Taliban network was built in part through U.S. Covert military aid and training. So it's not always fighter planes, but it's often U.S. supplied weapons and technology. And the problem is that industries like the aircraft industry lobby against the kinds of restrictions that would keep those small arms from going out across the world. So there's kind of a sort of a synergy between the large manufacturers and the light weapons manufacturers. I would like the Aerospace Industries Association to say unequivocally we would support stronger U.S. limits on things like cluster bombs. We'd support the global ban on that. Since they're not big profit makers for them, I think it would sort of help them clear their good name and really distinguish them from the weapons that are doing the most killing and devastation in the world. But I'm going to guarantee you they will not do that because they want to keep open regulations, open loopholes that you could drive a tank through, or an AK-47 through, or an M16 through, or a cluster bomb through. So there is this kind of synergy or kind of unholy alliance between the large manufacturers and the sort of smaller dealers who do sell most of the weapons that do the killing.
Question, Mr. Johnson, when you see incidents on the news, for example, the use of white phosphorus, as was the case in Gaza a year ago, and when you see issues such as conflicts where weapons that maybe have been developed in the US and have been modified or sold are used in certain areas, what's the general sense in the defense industry of the ethics of this?
Again, all I can tell you is that, one, the government determines who we can sell to. Two, the government puts strings on the systems. There is an issue as to whether the use of phosphorus violated either UN regulations and or US. I don't know where that came from. I don't know who sold it or whether it was indigenously developed. And again, I would point out that Israel has a very competent domestic defense industry. I'm still trying to figure out what Bill's talking about, where anything's been used against the U.S.
Well, sometimes
Mujahideen had stingers, for example. No stingers ever been used, to my knowledge, in Afghanistan. I would assume most of them have long been dead. They're dormant because they have seekers that need to be cooled, and these things are now ancient.
There is a risk countries who are friends become enemies, such as Iraq. Iraq one time as an ally, then it becomes an enemy, and so on. So you have
we never sold. We sold stuff to Iran. Iraq. Most of the stuff that Iraq had was Russian equipment. In fact, I think all of it was essentially Russian equipment. Some French. There were no. I'm trying to remember that when the Stark got hit, it was a French Exocet missile fired off of a French jet aircraft. So that again, I hold to my premise that we have not had U.S. weapons used against U.S. soldiers.
Okay. Well, William Hartung, in your opinion, obviously you want to see fewer arms out there for sale. What do you think, and only 30 seconds I'm afraid, sir, but what do you see as the mechanism to create some kind of change in the status quo?
Well, I think we need a global arms trade treaty. I think we need the United States to sign up to the global ban on cluster bomb use and exports. I think we need to tighten up our own regulations here in the United States so that human rights restrictions have a real meaning, that they're not only observed by exception. I think we need to stop government subsidies for weapons exports, because that fuels a lot of the sales to countries that wouldn't able to afford them otherwise.
I have to stop you there, but thank you very much, Mr. Hartung and Mr. Johnson. Thank you very much for taking part. And thank you for having your questions on the show. Beginning next week, be sure to follow the show at a new time as we move 4 hours earlier to 16:30 GMT. That's at 12:30 p.m. on the US East Coast, 5:30 p.m. in the UK, 6:30 p.m. in Cairo, and that's 10 p.m. in India. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to. You can give us your feedback on topics and post your questions and comments. On the next show, putting the brakes on Toyota, we examine the fallout of a massive recall by the Japanese automaker. How will it handle the crisis among the lawsuits and congressional investigations in the US? Be sure to follow that. We'll see you next time.